The story?
Is bananas?
It's bananas! For reals, though. I know we're such dweebs.
No, I mean, how can we not make that comment?
I know.
It would be offensive to our listeners.
It would. It really would. Power and corruption are two sides of a wicked coin. Welcome to the podcast that tells stories of the world's largest, most salacious corruption scandals and explores the myriad ways corruption creeps into the hearts and minds of men and women, the consequences of corruption for perpetrators and victims, and the red flags that, had they been identified and addressed, might change the course of history. I'm Diana Shaw, and I'm joined today by my co-host,
Tatiana Sainati.
We are lawyers at the DC-based law firm Wiley Ryan. I'm a partner in our white-collar crimes practice, and Tatiana is the head of our international arbitration and disputes group. Our story today is about bananas, Tatiana. Let me pause there and just get your reflection on that. I'm telling a scandal about bananas. What do you think about that?
I think it's bananas.
Oh my God, there we go again. We're going to have to really limit ourselves.
I mean, no promises.
All right. Our story begins in the late 1800s. I'm taking us way back.
We really are.
Yeah, but we're going to move through history quickly.
Okay.
It begins in the late 1800s with an American businessman with the old-timey name Minor Cooper Keith.
No, it wasn't.
Yes, Minor Cooper Keith. Now, just to set the stage, at this time in the Western world, bananas weren't really a thing. I know that's hard to imagine now because I think it's like the most common fruit.
We go through like 10 a week.
I bet
minimum.
you do. Yeah, I know, especially with kiddos. But basically outside of Central America at this time, no one had even heard of a banana. That's where we're at. But in 1871, this guy, Minor Cooper Keith, and a group of investors secured a contract to build a 100-mile railroad through Costa Rica.
Okay.
The project, however, was plagued with issues, and eventually the Costa Rican government defaulted on the loans that it had secured to finance the project. But Keith, who again is an American businessman, was able to raise separate financing to save the project. And as sort of like a thank you to him for salvaging the railroad, the Costa Rican government negotiated a deal with him whereby he received 800,000 acres of tax-free land along the railroad, plus a 99-year lease on the operation of the train route. And this is going to be critical to our story because it really kind of sets the stage for the later private corporate monopolies that we will see kind of end up essentially taking over these small governments in ways that prove to be incredibly problematic. So put a pin in that. As Keith continued to build the railroad, he would have banana plants, and I need to point out, because I learned this in the research, bananas grow on plants, not trees. He planted banana plants along the route on his free land, I might add, to supplement his workers' food supply.
Interesting.
So that was the whole point of the bananas in the first instance. And then when the project was finished, it turned out that there wasn't really enough passenger or cargo demand to cover his debt. And it looked like the project was once again on the verge of failure. So really, this whole thing is kind of a disaster. But our friend Minor Cooper Keith was not to be deterred. In what would turn out to be really a pivotal moment in history, Keith decided that he would become the Western world's banana supplier. So having planted acres and acres of banana plants along the railroad, he realized that he had a ready supply of the fruit, but he just needed to find a way to rapidly transport it to America, which was kind of a problem because, as you know, it's highly perishable.
Yes.
So he already had the railroad piece of it figured out, but what he decided to do is he started a steamboat line that ran directly from Costa Rica to New Orleans. And this ensured the timely and reliable delivery of bananas to American customers, who, by the way, didn't even want them at the time.
I feel I'm like nervous about rooting for this guy because I feel like I see where it's headed maybe. But he's ingenious.
He really is. I mean, he's an entrepreneur. He's a visionary.
And he is not stopped. He is not deterred.
No, and he's basically doing this on spec.
Yeah.
There's zero demand for bananas in America at this moment, but he's going for it. And so basically by dominating the trade route, he is able to take full control of the fruit trade in Central America and then later in Colombia for the remainder of the century until in 1899, he experiences a financial setback and he's forced to merge his operations with what was then the dominant fruit company in the West Indies, a company called the Boston Fruit Company. And this merger resulted in a company called United Fruit Company. And this is where things really get interesting. The United Fruit Company is important because it is the precursor to Chiquita banana.
We are Chiquita fans.
You are?
We also Dole. We are also a Dole family.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say we're just like a banana family.
Okay.
My boys can't
You
get
don't
enough.
discriminate?
We don't discriminate.
All right, so now I need to ask you, are you familiar with the term Banana Republic?
Yes, I am.
Not just
In
the
fact,
clothing store?
Not just the clothing store.
Okay. Do you know what it means?
I believe the term Banana Republic refers to a government that has been co-opted by a private company.
Yeah, that's basically right. So here is where we get to the part of the story where we learn why that term exists, okay? So as part of this merger, Keith is not out of the business. He actually becomes the vice president of the United Fruit Company. And in 1904, he signs a contract with the president of Guatemala. And the president gives the company these crazy tax exemptions, land grants, control of basically all the railroads on the Atlantic side of the country. And you might ask why a country would give such favorable terms to a foreign corporation. At least I asked that question. Seemed a little bit like a one-sided deal. So basically there were economic benefits, as you might expect. It resulted in a huge increase in exports, provided Guatemala with a major source of foreign currency. So that was a plus. It certainly provided a lot of jobs, but as we'll talk about later, question whether they were high quality or even really fair. We'll come back to that. But also the United Fruit Company invested a lot in the country, particularly in infrastructure. Yeah. So they built a ton of roads, railroads, ports, all of which facilitated transport and trade. So, you know, a win for the United Fruit Company, but also a win for the country.
This is the entire law and economics movement, right?
Yes.
Foreign direct investment is good. That's the thesis. I'm not saying that's 100% necessarily always the case.
Correct. As we will see, this did all come at a cost. It came at the cost of national sovereignty and control of their resources. So here's the flip side of that coin. And I think we can also speculate that there was some fairly heavy-handed bribery of senior officials going on to ensure the kind of political, shall we say, influence that was necessary to maintain United Fruit Company's dominance in the region. Eventually, the United Fruit Company repeated this model not only in Guatemala, but also in Costa Rica, Colombia, and Honduras, eventually coming to own 3.5 million acres across those 4 countries and wielding such remarkable control over the country's governments that the term Banana Republic was coined, as you said, referring to a small, usually politically and economically unstable country, reliant on a single export of a natural resource and often under the exploitation of a foreign corporate influence. And this is where things really get dark. So, yeah, there's not going to be a whole lot of humor from this point forward. So get ready. As we did say, Minor Cooper Keith was a visionary. Okay. So his speculation did turn out to be spot on. Demand for bananas in the U.S. in the early 20th century really started to grow. This was in part because of massive ad campaigns that were launched to teach people basically everything about the banana, when to know when a banana was ripe, how to eat bananas, how to prepare bananas. I don't know if you've seen this, but they even created this kind of like sexy banana character called Miss Chiquita in 1944.
You don't mean Chiquita with the fruit basket on her head?
Yeah.
Yes, of course I've seen her.
She had a little jingle, which I will not sing, but she was basically created to educate people on all things banana, and the ads worked. I pulled up some banana statistics. This is how I spent my Saturday. And apparently between 1913 and 1960, Americans' consumption of bananas increased by more than 40%.
Well, that's
so
a lot.
Huge, huge increase. But as we will see, this came at a cost. Not a cost that Americans paid, sadly, but a cost paid in other parts of the world. So the cost was paid in a couple of different places. First, let's talk about labor. So the United Fruit Company was pretty notorious for its poor treatment of its workers. They paid low wages, but that really doesn't capture it. I mean, sometimes they didn't even pay in money. Part of the issue is they often paid in coupons that could only be recouped in the company store. So if somebody quit the United Fruit Company, they didn't even have any money that they could use anyplace else. They had 7-day work weeks. They had no healthcare coverage. This led to an infamous uprising in Colombia called the 1928 Santa Marta or Banana Massacre. There was a massacre called the Banana Massacre. I know, it's so sad. Basically, workers had initiated a strike and were advocating for improved labor conditions, like, I don't know, a 6-day work week. That seems so reasonable. Payment in money rather
Also
than
reasonable.
coupons. Compensation for work-related accidents.
Also reasonable.
Yeah, these don't seem like outrageous demands. But the Colombian government, likely at the instigation of the United Fruit Company, surrounded the workers gathered in the square and opened fire.
Oh.
And reports conflict about the death toll, but the government says about 50 people died, and others claim that it was more like 2,000 people who were killed, all because of bananas and working conditions. So that's on the labor side of things. Let's talk economics.
Pretty bad.
Yeah. United Fruit Company's monopolistic practices, of course, really hurt local economies and competition. So basically, they had total vertical integration and supply chain domination, and that meant that they could set prices without competition, often at the expense of local farmers and workers. And this contributed to widespread inequality in the regions in which the company operated. Another way that they would protect their economic interests was by wielding enormous political influence. And this took varying forms, but I think it got probably most out of hand when United Fruit Company apparently played a role in the political overthrow of the Guatemalan government in 1954. So, following the Guatemalan Revolution of 1944, the democratically elected president of Guatemala introduced land reform policies. And these policies were perceived by the United Fruit Company as basically threatening their operations and their holdings in Guatemala. And so this is where things get kind of weird. Are you familiar with the last name Dulles?
Like Washington Dulles Airport?
Correct. Dulles Airport was named after the former Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who is the brother of a guy named Allen Dulles. And Allen Dulles, at this time in history, was heading the CIA and had also, coincidentally, previously sat on the United Fruit Company Board of Directors.
What could go wrong?
And also may have possibly still been on the United Fruit Company payroll at the time. Basically using propaganda to suggest that the existing Guatemalan government was communist, the CIA helped orchestrate a coup to overthrow the democratically elected government. That president ended up resigning under pressure, and this effectively safeguarded the United Fruit Company's interests, but also ushered in a period of military dictatorship in Guatemala marked by decades of human rights abuses and civil war. So it seems like a worthwhile exchange, right?
Totally.
Not problematic at all. Do you think we've hit rock bottom yet?
I'm afraid by your tone that we have not.
We have not, Tatiana. Here's where it gets really bad. How do we feel about drug trafficking and terrorist funding?
Super duper.
So, in 1990, the United Fruit Company officially became Chiquita Brands. And this is the ubiquitous name now most associated with bananas. In the early 2000s, it was revealed that between 1997 and 2004, Chiquita had paid millions of dollars to various Colombian military groups, including the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, known as AUC, to protect Chiquita bananas plantations in Colombia. AUC was known to be a drug trafficking terrorist organization responsible for numerous kidnappings, human rights atrocities, and extrajudicial killings. When this came to light, Chiquita admitted to the payments, but claimed they were necessary to protect the safety of their workers. In 2007, they ended up paying a $25 million fine to resolve criminal charges for funding a designated terrorist organization. So, okay, they admitted liability there. But then in June of last year, in what's considered a landmark case, Chiquita was found liable for the murder of 8 Colombians and made to pay $38.3 million in damages to the victims' families. And in reaching its verdict, the jury found that Chiquita knowingly provided substantial assistance to AUC through these bribery payments to a degree sufficient to create a foreseeable risk of harm, and therefore that Chiquita was responsible for the harm that then resulted in these 8 murders.
I would like to withdraw my previous comment that we're a Chiquita family. Exclusively Dole.
I know, right? It's so sad. So, yeah, a big bummer of a story with like maybe a smidge of a silver lining at the end.
Oh,
there was a
please get
little
there.
sliver of justice. I mean, they paid
got,
out in this landmark case. It's an interesting finding of liability.
Yeah.
But obviously, having gone through this entire story, the degree of harm, I think, far exceeds the finding of liability here if we take it in its totality. But yes, a very, very dark story and all over a banana, which I have to say is like arguably the world's most ridiculous fruit, right? I mean, it's the prop of pratfalls. It's hard to imagine that all of this could have happened because of
It's
the
wholesome
banana.
and cheerful.
You would think so, but I don't think I'm ever going to look at a banana quite the same way after this scandal.
No.
I will say, having gone on the Chiquita website, obviously the public image they're putting forward is cheerful. It's a very well-branded product, so it's hard to kind of reconcile that with the long history, but presumably they're trying to move things in a different direction, but they're still operating in a fairly unstable part of the world.
Well, and I think that is a crucial point, and I certainly, in saying this, by no means intend to condone in any way providing substantial assistance to paramilitary terrorist or drug trafficking groups, but there is, a question of what do you do if you have substantial business operations in a part of the world where there is no law and order, and where instead paramilitary groups, drug trafficking groups, cartels are in control. Because usually they do require some form of protection money. And so I guess it becomes a choice of, do you pay that protection money or do you shut up shop and suspend operations?
Well, I think that's maybe a nice segue to our red flag roundup, because this is definitely something I thought about when I was thinking about these red flags. And I think, bribery in support of cartels is really interesting, particularly right now, given some of the recent announcements that have come out of the new DOJ leadership. So just within the past few weeks, the new Attorney General, Pam Bondi, has announced new Foreign Corrupt Practices Act enforcement priorities. And the big shift is that the DOJ will be primarily targeting foreign bribery in support of or facilitating cartels and transnational criminal organizations. And I think what this means is for companies that are operating in areas where cartels have infiltrated the supply chain, infrastructure, transport, where these sorts of security payments are very customary, there's going to be a ton of FCPA risk and exposure. And the question is, how are these companies going to manage that risk and operate in this environment with this now kind of heightened risk of scrutiny under the FCPA?
Yeah, and I think in some ways it's interesting because in deciding that this is the type of claim that can be pursued, or this is the type of activity that can be pursued under the FCPA, there's almost an admission that these cartels and drug trafficking organizations, terrorist groups, are essentially quasi-government actors, that you are getting a benefit for your business by paying them. Because that's the type of behavior that the FCPA is really intended to target. And so what do you make of that? What do you make of this idea that we're essentially conceding that these organizations have such quasi-governmental authority and control?
I mean, it's sort of fascinating. I have to imagine that some of these governments might take issue or umbrage with us essentially taking that position. But I think you're exactly right. It does sort of presume that these cartels are operating in a quasi-governmental capacity. But when they have infiltrated things like customs and border crossings and things like that, it's hard to argue that they aren't performing those roles, or at least have interceded themselves in a way that gives them that function.
I think companies will certainly want to be extremely thoughtful about the diligence that they do and the investigations internally that they do to wrap their heads around what may be going on in their operations in these parts of the world. But that got a little bit more, I think, into how do we deal with a pretty grim on the ground reality rather than a red flag. And I do know there are some pretty interesting red flags in this one. One I had was monopoly power.
You want to go there?
I mean, we've been there before.
We sure have.
But I do think it's maybe just a play on the old adage, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts, absolutely. But when you have a monopoly, when there is no real competition and you're the only game in town, it is such a rife opportunity for this type of corruption. And here, it seems like the monopoly power of the corporations really enabled them to take over or to at least have substantial sway over legitimate governments. And it's, I think, always a difficult exercise to see how history might have played out differently. But you are left wondering, or at least I am left wondering, how would this have played out if these companies had been working to try and support democratic and thriving government institutions? And to what extent did their monopoly and their interference in governments create the kind of structural weaknesses in some of these states that created the opportunities for paramilitary and terrorist organizations to take such dominance?
Well, I think that's right. And I think this is the history that has largely resulted in today's ESG principles and a different corporate mindset. I think this is part of an evolution because we've seen the problematic impact that it can have when you don't consider those issues.
Yeah.
And so I think corporations are starting to be more sensitive to that. And I think governments are also becoming more aware of what's at stake. I mean, sort of relatedly, but to put it in a slightly different context, I think just thinking about the devil's bargain, because you can see how tempting it is when these economic benefits are being dangled in your face. And I don't think it's just in the, government to corporation context. When I was thinking about this story, I thought about small businesses and private equity as well.
Yeah.
It's, I think, kind of a comparable context. But I think, first of all, if it seems too good to be true, you probably need to be a little suspect. I think probably if I was counseling someone in this situation, I would start by thinking about the worst case scenario, how this could backfire and how your interests could be abused, and then kind of work backwards from there as you do your cost benefit analysis. But certainly in the context of a government and a corporation, I mean, you have to think about national security implications. So while it's wonderful for an outsider to come in and build roads and infrastructure and ports, if a foreign entity has control of your ports, that has national security implications. So you need to think about what that means and how you might want to structure that partnership to ensure that you're safeguarding those interests.
Well, and that, I think, from work that we've done in emerging markets and economies, the importance of a transfer of capacity, a transfer of knowledge to any of these partnerships, because what creates the perfect conditions for a monopoly is when there's only one game in town that has the know-how really to manage the ports, to manage the infrastructure, has that complete vertical integration and is not creating any up, down, or side stream economic opportunities for other businesses in the country, for citizens to be getting education, to have expanded economic opportunities. And so the importance of weaving those types of provisions into public-private partnerships, ensuring that there is a real transfer of capacity and not just the creation of jobs in the sense of manual labor type work, which is fine and which is, when not exploitative, a totally reasonable benefit to be bringing to a country. But it should be more than that. There should be opportunities for growth beyond just serving the company.
I want to just circle back to the knowledge transfer piece. I know you have experience having looked at different companies who have experimented with this and done so successfully. What's the model for a successful knowledge transfer in a situation like this?
Norway did an amazing job with its public oil company, and it did that in partnership with private companies. And there was a real transfer of, okay, we want locals working at all levels of the company. We want locals.
Like embedded within the company?
Embedded in, well, at least within the public-private partnership that they were creating, right? So they're not saying you have to make me,
CEO
of your company. But this public-private partnership that we're doing, this quasi-government interest that we're creating, we want board seats. We want you to be promoting at all levels within the company our workers. And so what does it take to get there? You need to have people, you need a pipeline. You need to be starting at different levels because you're not necessarily going to have people who can just come in and be, on the board. You need an education plan. Where are we going to send people to get educated? What kinds of grants are we going to give for people to study this? So it has to be holistic, I guess, is a big piece of it. And then putting in provisions that require the company to work with local companies. And that's the way you get those side stream, upstream, and downstream benefits. So, and Nigeria's actually had some success with this with Shell, with saying we're going to use a local company to come in and actually do some of the infrastructure that we're going to use for the oil extraction. So teaching them how to do that and then eventually transferring everything over to a local company. I think the case for governments for why that's important is really pretty obvious. I think the case for businesses is there as well, but it's maybe slightly less obvious. And it does require a little bit of long-termism rather than the near-term incentives of absolutely maximizing immediate value. And actually another flag I had written down is economic interest without any other goal. This notion of maximizing shareholder value, and that should be the sole purpose and sole obligation of a corporation, really also creates these types of conditions. Well, if companies can make more money and can do more good and can have more certainty if they're operating in a secure environment, if they're not having to bribe, for example, paramilitaries to protect their workers, if they have a competent and talented pool of labor to draw from in the areas where they're operating, if there is not the social and political conditions, the geopolitical instability that creates the conditions for coups and overthrows. And so thinking that way as a company, like to protect my long-term investment here, to create an additional important market for my goods, how can I be promoting those types of outcomes through the work I'm doing, while still, of course, earning a profit? And I think you're right that we're seeing more companies are starting to understand that.
Well, so maybe our silver lining in this otherwise quite bleak story is that because things went so terribly wrong here, governments have learned over time that they need to be more savvy, more careful, and more protective of their sovereign interests. And companies have learned, or at least decided, that they want to be better corporate partners and maybe pursue something more than just economic bottom lines. And so we're seeing some of these more creative models emerge, and maybe that's a positive. I don't know that we can draw a direct straight line between this scandal and what we're seeing today, but maybe they're all interconnected in some way.
I think they are interconnected, and I think it is a helpful and positive note to land on. We don't have to look at business as a zero-sum game where there have to be winners and losers. The idea behind the law and economic movement is a rising tide carries all boats. So let's make it a rising tide and not a tsunami.
I love that. Well, I want to thank our listeners for joining us for today's episode and invite you back next month for another scandal, this time told by you, Tatiana. Do we know what the scandal is going to be, or is it a surprise?
It is a surprise.
Okay. Well, we'll have to wait for that. Till then, if you like this podcast, please let us know by liking us on whatever listening platform you use, and maybe even sharing us with friends, family, or anyone you know who, like us, loves a good story about people behaving badly. As always, be good, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.